This is Brighter Rays, and today we're looking at Genesis 25, verses 5 through 6. And the title of this study is The Death of Abraham. That's what this section really is all about, 1 through 11. And today's little study we're looking at is focusing on verses 5 through 6. And I want to talk about the free grace of God. So as we look at the text says very simply that Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac. But while he was still alive, he gave gifts to his children, to his other children. Yet the other children were not allowed to stay near Isaac. Abraham sends them away to the east. That's always interesting. Remember the studies in the past, or maybe you haven't seen those, go back and watch those. But I talked about in the past how usually when they talk about the east, that means they're leaving the presence of God. And we see that over and over again, especially at the beginning of Genesis, that anytime anyone was falling away from God or leaving God's people, they were heading to the east. So, sometimes those things are coincidences, but sometimes they are representative of something too. So it's kind of interesting that Abraham sends them away to the east, not to the west, to the east. And I guess to the west, he would have to go down to Egypt or up around the other side of the Mediterranean. But maybe it's just easier to send people to the east. I don't know. That could be it. But anyway, he sends them out to the east. And remember the love that Abraham had for Ishmael. And no doubt he loved his other sons as well. He's a man. He's a good father. But those other children were not in his will. They were not to receive the estate. They were not to break up the estate and, parcel it out. And, they would not receive any inheritance. So after he dies, nothing would go to them. He gave them gifts while he was still alive. But after he dies, nothing would go to anyone else except for Isaac. They got some good gifts. But in the end, the estate and the covenant promises, the promises of God, were all given to Isaac alone. That's it. So, one of the things that when you talk about wills and estates and people dying, one of the things that always comes up is, well, it's not fair, right? People argue, people fight, families are broken apart because of, whatever the parents chose to do with their money and stuff after they died. And that's usually the claim. It's not fair. It's not equitable. Right? But as we look at the fact that Isaac alone received the promises, that claim can come up. Well, that's not equitable. Not everyone got the same thing. It's true. It's true. Very true. Abraham does not treat all of his sons the same way. A clear distinction has been made between Isaac and the rest of his siblings. If we remove this from its biblical context, most people would say, well, that's just unfair. That's not right. Right? That's what people would say. It's not right to favor one child over another like that. Even if we bring it back into the Bible in a different context, say Jacob's favoring of Joseph, we see the trouble his favoritism causes. And we say that was wrong for Jacob to favor Joseph. That's where a lot of the infighting in the family came from, is just Jacob kind of instigated that. And then it kind of come back to bite him in the butt anyway. I mean, with the dream, he's like, well, you're going to reign over me and, mother too. So, but why is it when we go to this story, we don't really make the same case? You don't see too many people being like, well, it's not fair that Abraham did that. That was wrong for Abraham to do that. Most people don't say that. I don't think I've ever heard anyone argue for that. So why don't we say it's wrong for Abraham to completely leave his firstborn and the other 6 sons out of the inheritance? Why don't we call foul on this play? I think it's because, in this case, God has made the choice. Remember, if the choice of who to favor was up to Abraham, he already made his choice. He chose Ishmael. But God made the choice of Isaac. When Ishmael was mocking Isaac, Sarah correctly pointed out the words of God to Abraham, saying that his boy will not share in the inheritance. That Ishmael was not the chosen one. God has spoken. God has chosen one and not the other. That's the end. Now the question is why? What reason is there to choose Isaac over Ishmael? Why choose Isaac over Midian? Why choose Jacob over Esau? Why choose David over his older brothers? Why choose Mary and Joseph over other godly couples that were alive when Christ was born? Why choose you and not all the other countless people that have died in their sins today? Why choose you? The answer we get from the Bible is simply the free grace of God. We call it free not because it didn't cost anything, right? Because it cost Jesus his life. But we call it free because it's not bound by anything. It's not bound by anything but God's own pleasure and his will. Not by external forces, not by us, but by God's own will. Look at the book of Hosea. The people are unfaithful. They have cheated on God, left him behind. There's no earthly reason why God would deal with them anymore. Why would God keep doing anything with them? Yet God says, I will have mercy. What? Why? I mean, God goes over and over again, explains how unfaithful these people are. It actually goes through this whole thing with Hosea to demonstrate how fallen they are, just how disgusting these people have become in their idolatry, in their love for everything else except for God. Why would God have mercy on them? He tells them, I'm going to have mercy on you. Why? That's what we walk away from that book. It's like, why would you have mercy, God? And God says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy. What does he say? It's my prerogative. It's his prerogative. It's his choice. You don't earn grace. There's nothing about you or what you have or what you've done that deserves grace. Why was Isaac the heir of the promises and the recipient of all the inheritance? Because God chose him. That's the answer. There really isn't another one. God doesn't explain his mind and his heart to us in every situation. And in this, that's the answer we get. It's God's grace. It's his free grace. He's not constrained by anyone. It's not because he looked at you and said, that'll be a good person. He didn't look down the quarters of time to see what you do and then choose you because of what you've done. That's not free grace. That means he's constrained by you. That means he is choosing because of your actions. That's not God. God does what his will is. He does what his own pleasure is. That's what the Bible tells us. So is it his will or pleasure, or is it because you did something? The Bible over and over again makes it clear. It's not because we've done something. It's because of who God is. We get the story of Jacob and Esau. Why is Jacob chosen, not Esau? Over and over again in the stories we get, even the first story that we get of Jacob and Esau. And they're and Esau is selling his birthright. That story just proves that, Jacob is a conniving, horrible man. And Esau just doesn't care. He doesn't care about the promises. He doesn't care about leading the family. He doesn't care about all that stuff. All he cares is about himself, going out there, running around, hunting, making his dad happy by giving him some good food. That's all he cares about. He doesn't care about leading the family and doing that. Jacob, on the other hand, wants to lead the family. He wants to take over. He wants to be in charge. But he has selfish ambition. It's all about him. And he doesn't really care who he hurts. He doesn't care if his mom is cursed on his behalf. He's like, oh, okay. You want to take the curse on my behalf if I get cursed? Pfft, sure, I'll go do it. This guy is no good. And really, we don't see him recognizing that God is his God until the end of his life. So, why did God choose Jacob? It's his own free grace. And praise God for that too. People sometimes buck against that idea, oh, God's grace is free. Well, that's not fair. It's not equitable. It's, why does he get to choose? He's God, right? If anyone gets to choose, it has to be him. It shouldn't be us. How could we choose? We're told we're dead in our sins and trespasses. We're dead. Dead men don't choose. But The eternal God who created all things, who knows the beginning from the end, who is in the beginning and the end at the same time, who exists outside of time, that's the one who can choose. That's the only one who can choose. So yeah, contemplate that for a while. Don't just, if you hear, oh, God chose, some people just have this knee-jerk reaction where it's like, well, you're saying that we're robots, that God is the author of sin? No, we're not saying any of that. That is not a necessary conclusion. That's a caricature. That is not the necessary conclusion to the idea that God chooses some and does not choose others. Does not make him the author of sin. People like to jump to that conclusion, but that's not the necessary conclusion of what that doctrine is. Some people hear the word election. Well, I don't believe in election. Well, if you're a Christian, you have to believe in election. It's just, what do you believe about it? So, because all Christians believe in election because that word's in the Bible. It says that God's people are God's elect, God's chosen. So, how does he choose and why does he choose? That's something you have to figure out. Obviously, the go-to text is Romans 9. You got to figure out what that means in the context of Romans, in the context of the whole Bible. And then even in these stories here, what did Isaac do to earn that? What does Jacob do to earn the promises of God and not the other guys? I mean, you have to be honest. It's really nothing. What did Abraham choose? He was just hanging out in the land of Ur. God chose him. It says God appeared to him and told him these things. Not that he was seeking God, that he was following after God with his whole heart, and God looked at his faith and said, oh, Abraham's a pretty good guy. I think I'll use him. It doesn't say any of that. He was hanging out there. We're told that his father was an idolater. So, yeah, he didn't deserve it. And neither do we.